An audit report released in 2020 found that the federal government bought a piece of land 30 years before it was needed at 10 times the price it was later valued at. The Liberals weren't very happy with that report.
Why is the Audit Office engaging in a gross cover-up? Is it to try and hide their incompetence?
We'll come back to that. In 2018, the federal government, through the Department of Infrastructure, bought 12 hectares of land for almost $30 million. The land, called the Leppington Triangle, is this piece next to what will be the Western Sydney Airport. The airport is currently being built, with a single runway expected to be operational in 2026. As demand grows, there's a potential for a second runway in the future. And by future, I mean in 30 years' time, in 2050. The Leppington Triangle would fall at the end of this second runway and would be set aside as a public safety zone. There isn't much use for the land other than that. The land was bought from the Leppington Pastoral Company, or LPC, a company owned by billionaire Liberal Party donors. But after buying the land for $30 million, the department valued it months later for only $3 million, 10 times less.
Before I let you go, what did you make of the federal government spending $30 million on a parcel of land in the new airport that is actually worth $3 million?
That eventually will be hailed as a good decision. I appreciate that, yes, it was very much over the odds. Appreciate there's a review going into actually how that actually happened. But eventually, when there is and needing to be more runways and more infrastructure built at Western Sydney Airport, they'll look back and they'll say, probably, what a bargain that was.
But the Australian National Audit Office didn't think it was a bargain and started asking some questions. They recommended the department do an internal review. So the department got the same people who worked on the purchase in the first place to review themselves. Unsurprisingly, they said, "We remain of the view that the transaction was settled appropriately." The Audit Office wasn't happy with that response and started a full audit. Not many people have heard of the Audit Office. It doesn't investigate corruption or have ICAC-like powers, but it still manages to uncover big scandals. It focuses on whether the numbers stack up, and if they don't, it can investigate. And that's an important role. We sometimes forget that while corruption is a misuse of taxpayer money, there is an equally large threat from incompetence and the lack of proper process. So what happened with the Leppington Triangle? The government had repeatedly done favours for LPC, the landowner. They changed road plans around the airport so it wouldn't impact them as much. And then they thought, great, we're now best friends and we can try and buy that land that we need in 30 years' time. But where things really went wrong was the valuation. Normally, when a government is wanting to acquire land, it would engage its own valuer to do a valuation of the land. The landowner would then get a valuer of their own to do a valuation. These valuations would be exchanged and an agreement would be reached. Instead, what happened was the government agreed to do a single valuation together with the landowner. This wasn't standard practice. Not only that, but the government's instructions to the valuer was that the work was to be a desktop assessment only. A desktop assessment means the valuer does not even inspect the property, and there are significant risks that the value won't be accurate. Now, valuations can provide 4 levels of comfort. The instructions given to the valuer was for the lowest level. In the end, the valuer ended up viewing the land from the curbside without going onto the property itself. This meant that they gave a restricted assessment, the second lowest level of comfort. The valuer even called this out in their report, saying that the Commonwealth accepted the commercial risks inherent in relying on a restricted assessment. But it gets worse. The original instructions on how to value the land was to have regard to the highest and best use. That's pretty standard valuation language, and how it should have been done. It means that the valuer considers the best use of the land that is legal and feasible. So for example, if you wanted to value land in a residential area for its highest and best use, you'd need to consider things like zoning and development restrictions. Unless there was a likelihood that zoning was going to change, you couldn't value it on the basis that it could be used to build a 100-level skyscraper. That would give an overinflated land value. So back to the Leppington Triangle, the instructions started off fine, but LPC wanted an amendment, and the government agreed. So the instructions were changed to have regard for the highest and best use, including industrial purposes. Keep in mind this was agricultural land, which would later be directly connected to an active runway and have no real development value. The Audit Office asked the department whether any additional instructions had been provided to the valuer, and the department said no. This was far from the truth. The instructions to the valuer had been amended numerous times. One amendment was for the land to be valued as if it had already been rezoned for industrial purposes next to an operating airport. The valuer pushed back, saying that such a hypothetical situation would mean they wouldn't even legally be able to call their report a valuation report. The final instruction was that the land be valued reflecting speculative industrial rezoning potential. The Audit Office called out a number of issues with this. This instruction didn't consider the realistic future development potential of the land, nor did it consider regulatory controls like airport noise and height restrictions that would come into play. You can't have a factory sitting at the end of a runway, where land is meant to be reserved as a safety zone in the event a plane can't stop in time. Yet in my view, that is what the valuation was assuming. The government knew that things weren't quite right, because they made both the valuer and LPC sign confidentiality agreements so that the public wouldn't learn about how the valuation was done. They had noted at the time, should the terms on which the valuation is conducted become public, the Commonwealth may be criticised for its approach. Over the next 2 years, several independent valuations were done on the land. This was the joint valuation, and was the one used to come to the final sale figure of $30 million. At no point did the government question the huge difference in what they had paid and the subsequent valuations. When all this was being revealed, Scott Morrison came out and said he's disappointed in what had happened. But in Parliament, the Liberals continued to undermine the findings.
Why is the Audit Office engaging in a gross cover-up? Is it to try and hide their incompetence at the grossly misleading report on the Leppington Triangle, where they made a fundamental error of fact in placing the triangle outside the airport zone? The Auditor-General has misled the people of Australia by using incorrect zoning and averaging the lowest valuations rather than using the highest valuation in order to smear the government and stop the construction of nation-building infrastructure.
That's Liberal Senator Gerard Rennick. He has repeatedly tried to prove the audit findings wrong, but hasn't had much luck.
Are you aware that there's currently a property on 250 Badgerys Creek Road, 5-acre property, for sale for $5.7 million?
You can get it for 50
I'm not,
It's all right, you're probably not.
I'm not personally aware of that, no, Senator.
So the accounting standards dictate that you value an asset at lower of net realisable value or cost. So given that 2 acres is worth almost, 5 acres is worth almost $6 million, how would the Audit Office value 30 acres at $3 million for land in a similar area?
Can I just add, it actually isn't the Auditor-General who, Senator Rennick's saying that the Auditor-General has valued the land.
No, Australian National Audit Office.
So the Auditor,
It's the same thing.
The Auditor-General put in the Auditor report a lot of examples, but didn't actually take a position on what the true value should be.
No, because the Auditor-General's not a valuer. They relied on independent they referred to independent valuations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've got 30 years in finance, I've got a Master's of Finance, and I
You often
understand
remind us of that,
valuations,
Jerry.
goodness.
You
So
often remind
I'm
us of
quite
that.
capable of forming my own valuations, thank you.
Are you a valuer?
Yeah. No, I can value property all the time, it's not hard. You just go look at the market value, look at the market value on the internet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well I've got values here that I got off realestate.com in 5 minutes, right? I didn't need to spend $330,000 to work this out. 5 acres of land for sale for $5.7 million. $5 million for 12 acres. All of these values clearly exceed $3 million. So no matter how you want to value it on a best use value, it's worth at least $30 million. Yet you haven't highlighted that at all. You've focused on agricultural use, which is not what we're buying the land for.
Well, actually, Senator, we haven't. The valuations were procured by others, as the Auditor-General said. The thing about highest and best use is it has to be what the land can be used for. Now, I haven't seen the valuations you're referring to, but this land is located at the end of what is to be the proposed second runway.
Yep.
It's in the public safety zone.
Yep.
It can't be used for residential. It can't be used for industrial. It's not part of the Aerotropolis. It can't
No, hang on. So we're buying it because we're going to use it for infrastructure purposes, right?
As Senator, best use, as we set out in the audit report under the valuation standards, means it has to be something which is feasible to be used for. This land is not feasible to be used for industrial.
That assumption is wrong. It's feasibly used for an airport second runway in 40 years' time.
I'm not-
Well, no, he's implying, the Auditor General's implying that it's a speculative purchase. It's not...
Sorry, no, I wasn't implying it was a speculative purchase. I was saying that it's unlikely that the procurement rules for land suggest that the government should pay as a price a speculative valuation based upon some future potential possible changes to land use which aren't foreseeable at the current point in time.
Exactly. Senator Rennick, who isn't a valuer, has been trying to prove the auditors wrong by rocking up to committee hearings with realestate.com printouts of random properties for sale in the general area. He doesn't seem to understand that you can't value property based on unrealistic speculation. But Senator Rennick must have missed some big parts of the report, because there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet. The Leppington Triangle was mostly purchased by the federal government, but at the same time, a portion was also purchased by the New South Wales government. Both were negotiating with the same landowner, LPC. The New South Wales government paid $109,000 per hectare for their portion. The federal government paid $2.4 million per hectare. The difference was that the federal government paid 22 times more per hectare from the same landowner for the same piece of land. What's even more ridiculous is that before they finalised their draft valuation, the federal government found out that New South Wales had already done a valuation of their own. The department decided to share their valuation with the New South Wales government to reduce the possibility of LPC using it as leverage. New South Wales then sent their own valuation to the department, which showed a much lower figure, and they also provided feedback on issues which they saw in the federal government's valuation. Despite that, the department met with LPC that same day with a file note saying, "Discussed methodology for valuation, no problems noted, will confirm it is okay to finalise the draft." The valuation was finalised without any comments or amendments. Because the land wasn't needed for so long, it was leased straight back to LPC after the sale. The same valuer was used to do another valuation for the purposes of figuring out the rent. That valuation put the land at $920,000. The rent ended up being less than $35,000 a year. Imagine that. You sell your land for $30 million and then just lease it back for $35,000 a year. You'd be able to pay rent for 850 years before you're out of pocket. After the audit report was released, the government ordered a bunch of further reviews as if the audit report wasn't clear enough. These reviews and a subsequent AFP investigation found no evidence of criminal conduct. This was seized on by media articles and politicians alike, as if it somehow detracts from the seriousness of the wastage of taxpayer funds. But in reality, these reviews found numerous failings by the department. The minister responsible for the department, Paul Fletcher, was also quick to selectively quote from these reviews to minimise the seriousness of the whole thing. He had a very different tone from when he was outraged over Australia Post spending $20,000 on watches.
I was as shocked and concerned as everybody else to discover this when it was revealed in estimates this morning. The government's view is that the boards and managements of government business enterprises need to take great care with taxpayers' money. They need to take great care with taxpayers' money.
I wonder if it had anything to do with the fact that in this case, he had signed the deal brief off with the phrase, "seems perfectly sensible to me."
The determination of the amount to pay for a property is a judgment, was the wording of the independent audit. Officers exercised that judgment in the case of the Leppington Triangle and paid a price per square metre that is not inconsistent with numerous recent transactions in the region. Those are not my words, but the words of an independent review.
The audit report did find that decision makers and the minister weren't given all the appropriate facts, but in my view, they were given more than enough to ask a few questions. The more important point here is that the Audit Office is a critical body to keep the government departments in check. It can shine light on wasted taxpayer money and reduce future wastage. The problem is that the Audit Office has had its funding slashed for a while now, meaning they haven't been able to do the number of audits they are required to do.
So I presume that means, yes, you drew the Prime Minister's attention to the fact that the number of audits will decrease from a standard of 48 down to something that is 20% less?
Yes.
Okay.
Funding hadn't been perfect under Labor, but you can see the real drop in the last number of years that the Coalition has been in government. After a lot of begging from the Audit Office, the 2021 budget finally included a funding increase for the organisation, but even then, they didn't get what they asked for. The Audit Office needs to be fully funded. Money spent there is money well spent if it means less wastage across government. As to the Leppington Triangle, the whole issue basically went away. The government wiped their hands clean, and that's worrying because the same department that couldn't get this land purchase right is in charge of spending billions of our dollars. If you made it to the end, then thank you. These videos take ages to make, and right now I'm a one-man show. If you'd like to help support this channel grow, consider checking out my new Patreon page. Links are in the description below.